Hi, welcome to my Cultural Connections project. Through this project, I'll be exploring how different cultures view artistic renditions of sexuality. My Cultural Connections project is an interwoven piece, focusing on 4 distinct dance forms with hula as my main focus, and how they connect in terms of their culture's historical experience/view of sexuality as explored through dance. I'm personally interested in this topic because of its saturation throughout dance history. Many of the dance forms we've explored throughout this class contain the sensuous root, despite originating from fundamentally different cultures and dance expressions. Throughout this presentation, I want to highlight the nexuses between these differing cultures and theorize as to why artistic sexuality is similarly shunned in such drastically different societies. Contributing to this conversation is important to me because I do not agree with the sanitation of art and consequently culture, nor how sex is viewed in our society today, especially as it dampens natural elements of humanity like sensuality and attempts to distance us from ourselves. I will compile and present this information via Canva, make use of photo and text slides, as well as pulling from outside research sources such as Google Scholar, in conjunction with the textbook and slides from this course. First, we explore the representation of sensuality through art. What are the differences as we observe these dance forms and note how sexuality was explored and talked about in their earlier versions, as opposed to their expressions following sanitation and colonization? In order to do so, we must make the distinctions between sensuality as displayed through performance versus the truth behind what is being depicted in the performance. Can the two be mutually exclusive? And is there a correct way to display intimate concepts in performance? To me, intention paves the way to respectful depiction of this side of humanity. Again, let's look at hula and Hawaiian culture as an example. Historically, hula has been a multifaceted dance form, utilized as means to portray many different concepts as important to Hawaiian culture. A prevalent aspect within the hula genre is sexual representation. Many of these dances encourage procreation, centering Laka, a goddess of fertility, around the practice. Mele Mai is another instance of the importance of sex in Hawaiian culture. During this performance, the chief's genitals were celebrated, marking a highly sexual performance. However, we can juxtapose this celebrated portrayal to the infamous hula girls, popularized by the media later in history. These girls were depicted in sexual scenarios, purposely clad in provocative clothing, and dancing in a sensual fashion. What marks the difference between these two renditions? They both present sexuality through performance, yet they each bear a drastically differing connotation. This brings us back to intention. The ancient Hawaiians' depiction of sexuality was pure, an ode to real life, whereas the later renditions of hula are presented with the intention to be looked at for their sexual factor, and consequently viewed in an almost pornographic way. True hula is artistic, an exploration of humanity, a celebratory practice. The latter does not represent sensuality in this fashion, instead pushing it forward to attract a response and pry on the vices of men. Tango bears a similar history. It too was sanitized in lieu of the emerging push of Christian morals. Prior to the shift, the music which accompanied the dance was sensual in nature, often containing racy lyrics to accompany the intimate movement style. However, differently from hula, following the movement's censorship, it became a widespread Argentinian symbol of pride. Yet, did this newly moderated tango retain the same level of artistic exploration? Yes, its sanitization aided in the spread of the art, but at the cost of diverting its original probe of sensuality. Today, tango is often categorized as home tango or export tango. Home tango is represented by a community-oriented atmosphere, bringing people together, whereas export tango exhibits a more theatrical, sensual vein. I find export tango comparable to the hula girls mentioned prior. There is an element of performative sexuality about export tango, the same purposeful showcase of in-your-face eroticism. Again, this is not a performance rooted in reality. Sure, it's a depiction of sensuality, but its intention is not to represent humanity, but instead to enrapture its focus and capitalize off desire. In an article, a commentary on sexuality as explored through tango was translated from Spanish to English and further highlights my point, painting true representation of sexuality as a pure encounter, not a provocative one. The quote says, "The sexual relation is the only way to recuperate that most beautiful, deep thing, richer than words, the dialogue of the skin. And tango has something of this. It cannot be danced naked because it is representation. It is not the sexual act, but the evocation of sexuality." Another prevalent factor when considering the suppression of sensual dance is the swayed acceptance of male versus female displays of sexuality. Let's explore kabuki, a traditional Japanese dance known historically for its often provocative movement and storylines. What is unique to kabuki is that it was originally performed solely by women. This was changed, however, when the Japanese government decided the art form was tainting public morals. Following this declaration, kabuki shifted, then only allowed to be performed by men. Interestingly, the concern for these indecent morals fell away following this shift, and unlikely by coincidence. Something of a woman displaying her sexuality through performance is somewhat universally seen as unwieldy, due to stereotypes and preconceived ideals of how women should present themselves. Similarly, the distaste for sexually liberated women ended the Devadasi tradition, an Indian ritual court dance. These women were married to a god upon entering the court, and were not permitted to enter a monogamous marriage. Said women were not unlimited in the sexual realm, and had more economic and individual autonomy than other Indian women during this time period. The Devadasis practice came into ridicule, however, in an attempt to civilize. British colonists banned the practice due to its erotic nature, and permitted the court women to pursue monogamous marriages. One could argue this was a positive shift in many ways, as those who practiced the Devadasi tradition were often involved in prostitution. Yet it is also arguable this was a direct attack on the freedoms of these women, and hindered their ability to express themselves artistically, that instead forced to conform to the British expectations of women. As we can see, much of this limitation in terms of women's portrayal of sexuality in dance has to do with the Christianized views of the pure woman. Throughout this presentation, we have observed Christianity inject its morals into cultural expression, often taking away the portrayal of human life that was lived by the peoples performing it, and replacing it with renditions tainted by ideals which did not originally concern the culture from which the dance originated. This is especially true when taking how women were affected by this into consideration. Women should be allowed to represent themselves, artistically or otherwise. We cannot change history, but it is a pity so many unique cultures were reformed in this way. To conclude, ultimately, the similar trajectory of censorship within these cultures is a direct result of colonization, or a forced shift in moral standing. The Christianized view of the pure woman also furthered this sanitation, limiting women's sensual exploration and creative expression. This ideology was usually spurred by an incorrect view of the intention of the sexual elements of performance, viewing them almost as pornographic instead of an artistic celebration of life and the depiction of the natural human experience. These are my sources. Thank you.